Hey, St. John. Welcome to the Post-Sermon Podcast. I am Deaconess Dahlia, and with me today is Pastor Adam.
Hi, Deaconess.
Today we will be talking about your sermon from this past Sunday, which was Palm Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week. And fun fact, we're also recording on Maundy Thursday.
Still Maundy Thursday.
Still Maundy
Still catching
Thursday.
up.
This is the second episode we're recording. And I'm excited because this was, I thought, a great sermon, and just Palm Sunday is just such a wonderful day with a lot of just good theology to talk about of Jesus' triumphal entry, and we're going to talk about cleansing of the temple a bit. So I'm excited. Tell me about the text that you preached on.
So I actually preached on Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 to 17. And this is not something that's officially in the lectionary for Palm Sunday. Typically, you read from John 12 at the beginning of the service, and you either keep reading in John 12, or at some point in some congregations, you'll read the Passion account of Jesus on Palm Sunday. But we are not going to get into Passion Sunday today, Deaconess.
Why did you...
Go ahead.
So why did you go that route?
Yeah, it was back when we were planning our Holy Week services. We really wanted to focus on the Passion according to the Gospel of Matthew. And so that meant we would pick out readings that would correspond with Matthew. And while we did read from John in the narthex, because that's where it actually mentions the palms, in the sanctuary, we picked up at the next part after Matthew's Palm Sunday event, and that's when Jesus starts to, as my ESV says here, Jesus cleanses the temple, but I know we'll talk more about that. And we read a little bit further. And then how we ended the services, we kept going in Matthew, and you'll all hear this as we go through Maundy Thursday and Good Friday and so on. We're just going to stick with Matthew for the remainder of the week and let Matthew tell the gospel from his perspective and according to him.
What was the central teaching of your sermon?
The central teaching was that God will not be cheated of his triumph. I was adapting some language from W.H. Auden's Christmas oratorio. It's something I like to look at between Christmas and Lent, when you're kind of packing away the Christmas trees and all that. And the cross of Good Friday is not far now is a huge move in the poem. But this idea of not being cheated of triumph, and God is going to do what God is going to do this week, no matter who gets in his way. And that I think you said how Palm Sunday has a lot of good theology. That's a big piece of it is God's plan is unfolding as God has set this out. Everyone thinks their plans are unfolding. People are conspiring and figuring things out and setting up betrayers and what's the price to pay. God's going to do what God's going to do, and it's all going to play into God's hands.
The irony is thick in the Gospels with
yes.
that, right?
Yeah, by the time you get to the Passion account, there's such a use of irony and double meaning and all of it, and it's too much, which is why we read them over and over and over.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too sidetracked, but I was just thinking with first grade religion, I had asked them how could Jesus have come off of the cross? Would he have been able to do that himself? And the answer is, of course, yes, he's God. He's done all these miracles. And kind of going back to what you were saying, I mean, this wouldn't have happened without God's will, right? His permission. This was his plan to save us. And it seems like all these evil people or unknowing people, whatever word you want to use, that it's all in their hands, but it's just the exact opposite.
Right. Jesus is very much in control, even at times when he does not look like he's in control.
Right, exactly. So let's talk a little bit about how you approached this sermon. You had an interesting sermon structure, how you were telling the story of Jesus's triumphal entry, and then the temple as well.
Yeah, if you were to just pull out the main plot points, it was Jesus is sitting on the donkey. He hears children singing. Jesus gets off the donkey. He sees that he's in Jerusalem. Jesus enters the temple, cleanses it, leaves, and hears children singing. Those are the main plot points of the sermon. And yet I really wanted to slow down and focus on what's going on, and kind of by telling the story of it in an interesting way, I wanted to draw on a number of theological themes that are embedded in Matthew's gospel. Because again, we're focusing on Matthew this week. I thoroughly inundated the sermon with Matthew references. And I like the idea of starting the sermon with Jesus hearing the singing of children, and as he leaves the temple, it's the singing of children, and a reminder of Jesus has come to save all of us, even the little children. Let them come to him too.
What is the significance of Jesus entering Jerusalem, and then immediately we get in Matthew that he goes to the temple and clears it? Like, why does Matthew make that transition?
Yeah, well, that's great. There's two big questions there. The fact that he's in Jerusalem, that's a big part of the sermon of, in the Synoptic Gospels, you are waiting for Jesus to end up in Jerusalem. And he predicts it at least 3 times. Hey, we're going to Jerusalem. We're going to Jerusalem. Even one of our Lenten readings, it was from Luke. The gospel is like, it's a see, we're going to Jerusalem. It's like Luke 19 or whatever. I mean, it's a huge deal when Jesus finally arrives in Jerusalem, but you kind of lose that with our church here and lectionary. This is where it's all going down. And this is the big final act, right? And I try to highlight that idea. And so it cannot be stressed enough how important it is that the King, Jesus, has arrived in his royal city. And all the mixed themes of Hosanna to the Son of David, right, in this kingly language. And then by Friday, he's crowned with thorns. And
right, that crowd will kill him.
Yes.
And just wondering, too, his feelings of, I mean, he knows exactly what's coming.
Yes. So cannot stress enough how big of a deal it is that Jesus is coming to Jerusalem, and he's here. That's a big theme in the Gospels, the Synoptics especially. And then you talk about the temple, and Palm Sunday, we usually just read the triumphal entry, and then that's it.
Yeah, I think people forget. I know I have, forget that that's the clearing of the temple is right after.
Yes.
I don't know, it's separated when we tell the story.
And if Jerusalem is loaded with all sorts of Old Testament thematic weight, another place in the structure would be the temple itself. First tabernacle, then temple, destroyed, rebuilt after exile. The temple is where God dwells with his people. And Jesus enters the temple. And this is where you get what's called the cleansing of the temple, or the clearing of the temple, or the purification of the temple, where your different Bible editors will call it different things. But I know we have some questions related to the temple clearing, and they're going to lead us into some fun reflections.
Okay, here's our first question about the temple. With so many different people and transactions occurring in the temple, I imagine there was security. Jesus could have been arrested there after his actions? That's a question. Could he have been arrested?
That's a good question. This goes to sometimes a misunderstanding of the clearing of the temple. We'll call it that for now, or the cleansing of the temple. It's not that Jesus went through the entire temple complex and did this everywhere. Because, that would probably be, an arrestable offense or just, unruliness. It was more likely he was just in one part of this larger complex and flipped over some tables there and then left.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we might just liken this to, even Sunday morning here. Hey, you talked to so-and-so. Oh, I didn't even see them. Oh, they're in this part of the building. Or you're in a hospital, and how many different things are happening in different floors of the hospital, all simultaneously going on, or in a stadium. The temple complex was much larger than just one room. And this ongoing discussion and debate amongst scholars, what was the size, what was the, actual layout of the place. But it was probably just something really small, like, he flipped over some tables of some of the vendors, and that was it. And that kind of helps with some of the security question there. And if you hung out there too long, well, maybe they would hasten up the security thing. But also, we also know that the people held Jesus in high regard at this point in the week. And the leaders, even if the security wanted to arrest him, they couldn't, because it would cause a much worse scene, right? The riot and mob would be against the leaders as opposed to against Jesus by Friday.
Yeah, that would make sense. Okay, let me get to the second question. This week's readings and sermons prompted the meditation. Could it be that what we refer to as the cleansing of the temple was not a cleansing at all, but instead a sort of pre-demolition of the temple? The first steps in replacing the temple as the center of worship with Christ as the center, the temple.
And this is I love this question, because this gets to another huge theme. In our history, 70 AD is an important day, because that's when the temple gets destroyed. and is never rebuilt. This is the judgment that Jesus speaks of at the beginning of Matthew chapter 24, concerning the destruction of the temple. When Jesus clears the temple or cleanses it or purifies it, again, these are all editors' headings that our Bible editors throw in here. It cannot be meant that as Jesus is reforming the temple, or Jesus is fixing the bad practices so it can actually do the right thing. No, it's the temple's going away because Jesus is here. The temple of his body. Even in Matthew, I think it's in 26, you get a little bit of some of the accusations against him about to destroy the temple in 3 days and he'll build it up. While John does this more explicitly in John chapter 2, and John even gives us the note saying, hey, he's talking about his body. You actually get, let's see here. Yeah, Matthew chapter 26. We'll hear this on Good Friday. This is when he's being interrogated before Caiaphas and the council. Many false witnesses came forward. At last, 2 came forward and said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. Now, you don't get all the back commentary that John says. He's actually talking about his body. And the point is, Jesus is replacing the temple. All the Old Testament stuff is being fulfilled in him. That was all type and shadow. He's the real deal. He's the real thing. And what we see in Matthew is, by the time he's crucified, what happens to the temple? Curtain torn in two. The temple is being set aside. Christ is the new reality. And so, yeah, this cleansing of the temple is the first sort of, we don't need this anymore. And that's what I try to convey in the sermon there, and even referencing things like Matthew chapter 9, the old wineskins and the new wineskins. Why using the old ones? The new is here. It's me, Christ. So, yeah, no, it's a really good question. And, yeah, I think sometimes our editors' headings can be a little misleading in our Bibles. It was not a cleansing as an act of reforming or fixing the problems. No, it's all going away because the real thing is here now. The type and shadow is no longer needed.
So perhaps saying pre-demolition of the temple would be a better, more accurate title for that section.
Right, and the demolition comes 70 AD. Yeah, the day of the Lord, as spoken of by Jesus in Matthew 24, the first 35-ish verses.
How did you intend to benefit your hearers in their faith or life?
Part of my goal by slowing down and just telling just these few plot points and trying to tell them in an in-depth and engaging way was to help us get our footing for the narrative of the Gospels, and especially the Gospel according to Matthew. We're going to spend time in Matthew this week. Let's get our bearings on what's actually happening in the sort of beats that lead up to the remainder of the week. Again, the lectionary, as nice as it is, it does bounce around. It does chop up the narrative. And I want us for this week to be really clear on what's the story. How is God going to go about saving us? How will God not be cheated of his triumph? Here's what God's doing. And so, especially related to the Jesus being in Jerusalem, he's in the temple. Those things I wanted to make sure we have straightened out as we head into the remainder of the week.
I wanted to emphasize your last paragraph, the conclusion of your sermon. I thought it was just a good connection between Palm Sunday is the beginning of this work in Jerusalem that he has to do. So I have it with me, so I'm just going to read it if that's okay. To the singing of children, Jesus left Jerusalem only briefly to stay the night in Bethany. Tomorrow he will return to Jerusalem, for he has more work to do this week because God's will be done. The darkness will come. The curtain must be torn in two. The earth will quake. The rocks will split. The dead must be raised, whether they be child or adult, scribe or chief priest, disciple or you or me. For God will not be cheated of his triumph. So I really like that. I thought that was nice just to remind us he has more work to do. This is gearing us up for Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and of course we know the resurrection of our Lord on Sunday.
Yeah, thanks, Deaconess. And I'll just make another comment here. This is an interesting challenge of preaching Holy Week, is to let the different days and beats of Holy Week be their own thing. And while all preaching should be centered in the death and resurrection of Jesus, and then I was trying to do that in the sermon here. You notice I don't spend too much time on Good Friday and Easter, but it certainly is embedded throughout the sermon. Right now it's just Palm Sunday. So that's an interesting sort of thing you'll notice with the different sermons throughout the week too, of where are we at in the story and what's being emphasized and what's still there, but maybe is a little more peripheral.
This wraps up the episode for today. Thank you for listening to our discussion. In case you missed today's sermon or you'd like to listen to it again, the link to the sermon's in the show notes. You can also find the sermon on our church website, stjohndublin.org. If you, the listener, would like to submit a question about a sermon, please email us at podcast@stjohndublin.org. Thank you, Pastor, for joining me and for feeding us the word this week.
We got one more podcast to record on this Maundy
Thursday.
We'll see you all then.
All right, take care, you guys. Bye.
Bye.